This is the Holy Gospel according to John. So when the crowd saw that neither Jesus nor his disciples were there, they themselves got into the boat and went to Capernaum, looking for Jesus. When they found him on the other side of the lake, they said to him, "Rabbi, when did you come here?" Jesus answered them, "Very truly, I tell you, you are looking for me not because you saw signs, but because you ate your fill of the loaves. Do not work for the food that perishes, but for the food that endures, for eternal life, which the Son of Man will give you. For it is on him that God the Father has set his seal." Then they said to him, "What must we do to perform the works of God?" Jesus answered them, "This is the work of God, that you believe in him whom he has sent." So they said to him, "What sign are you going to give us, so that we may see it and believe you? What work are you performing? Our ancestors ate the manna in the wilderness, as it is written, 'He gave them bread from heaven to eat.'" Then Jesus said to them, "Very truly I tell you, it was not Moses who gave you the bread from heaven, but it is my Father who gives you the bread from heaven. For the bread of God is that which comes down from heaven and gives life to the world." They said to him, "Sir, give us this bread always." Jesus said to them, "I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never be hungry, and whoever believes in me will never be thirsty." This is the gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, O Christ.
Please be seated. In 2016, one of the churches that I served received a domestic hunger grant to build a community garden. When we announced to the congregation that we had received a grant to build the garden, they had lots of questions. Would the soil on the church grounds have adequate nutrients to support vegetables? Who would do the hard physical work of building the garden, cutting the sod, digging the post holes for the fence posts, putting up the fencing, tilling the soil, planting the seeds? Are there really people in our neighborhood who would want a garden plot? Some wondered if we should use the money for something else. Maybe we should start a food shelf or use the money for a weekly community meal. The thing is, change can be hard. The church had never had a community garden. What if we went through all of the hard work building the garden and it sat empty with no gardeners or no vegetables filling up the space? Well, I went to work giving myself a crash course in how to build a community garden. I went to the U of M to have our soil tested. I called several of the local churches who had built community gardens on their property, and I read every article and every book I could get my hands on about building community gardens. I wanted to prove all of the skeptics wrong. I wanted to demonstrate to the folks that had given us the grant money that they had invested their money wisely. So when the ground thawed and dried out enough to start cutting the sod, we began the hard work of building this garden. We had a number of setbacks in the building process, including a really bad snowstorm in late April. We didn't have enough folks who were often willing or able to help with the project. And the inexperience that I had as the leader of the project building this garden showed through the process. The truth is, I had a lot of knowledge in my head about how to build a community garden, but I had never built a garden that big before. We hope to have the garden up and ready for people to start planting in May. But the setbacks got in the way, and the garden wasn't ready until mid-June. Many neighbors who had initially shown interest in having a plot in the garden weren't interested anymore. I started to have doubts that this gardening project was a good idea at all. And after a couple of weeks of waiting for people to come to the garden started to grow weeds. We had worked so hard filing the paperwork for the grant, writing the paperwork as well. So much backbreaking physical labor had gone into cutting the sod, digging the post holes, putting up the posts, attaching the fencing to those poles, applying the compost, and tilling the soil. And we had spent a lot of money. And I had pushed so hard for this project, telling everybody it would be great for our neighborhood and a way for us to build relationships with the community. I've definitely had times in my life where I felt like I've failed. This felt like one big failure to me. I tried to put a positive spin on the whole thing, saying, well, we'll be ready when the gardening season rolls around next year. But every morning when I drove to church and parked my car in the parking lot next to the garden, I couldn't help but see the weeds growing taller every day. It was a hard pill to swallow. But then something unexpected happened. Some of the women from the Hmong congregation called Calvary's Cross, the congregation that shared our church space, approached me about the garden. They said they were actually interested in using the space, and they definitely said that they had vegetables that they could start growing at this point in the season. I can't tell you how excited I was. I immediately went to the pastor of Calvary's Cross to tell him how glad I was that his church community wanted to use the garden space. He looked at me and said, "We are not interested in using your garden space." I said, "I don't understand." Several of the women from the congregation said that you are. "Well, we are not," he said, and he walked away. This went on for a few days. A group of women from Calvary's Cross would approach me saying, "Well, yes, we actually do want to use the garden." I would go to the pastor and he would tell me the exact opposite. I could not figure out what was going on. So I went to another Hmong pastor to help me figure out if there was something going on culturally that I just didn't understand. And he too said the whole thing seemed really strange. He could not give me any insight into the mystery. Well, it wasn't too many days later that I found out what was going on. The pastor of the Hmong congregation came up to me and asked, "Can we plant whatever vegetables we want, or do we have to plant the vegetables that your congregation wants?" I was devastated by the question. I felt like I had worked really hard to build his trust. Obviously, I hadn't done enough. I said, "Of course, you can plant whatever vegetables you want, Pastor." As I tried to process this all with another church leader, she said, "Nate, he's been told his whole life by people like you what he can and can't do, what spaces in the church congregation he can use, the rules he has to follow when he uses those spaces. Of course, it was his assumption that he would be told what kind of vegetables he would have to plant." I think we often read about injustice, inequality, and racism. We hear about those things in the news. We know those things are real in our nation and in our world, but until we see those things played out in the faces of people that we know when we see how painful injustice, inequality, and racism are on the faces of people we have a relationship with, then we start to understand the impact of those things. We often don't understand how devastating those things can be and how they can keep people from living their full potential. It's easy to hear about injustice, inequality, and racism and say those things don't have anything to do with us until those things show up in the personal stories of those we know. And we decide that we have to do better. The story has a really good ending. The Hmong congregation went to work transforming the garden from a weed patch to a beautifully tilled space. Structures were put in place that would eventually hold up climbing vines, and seeds were planted from which plants would grow, and vegetables that I was totally unfamiliar with, that I would need to learn about, would grow. For the people of Calvary's Cross Church, gardening was a communal process. Plots weren't divvied out to individual gardeners. They shared the whole space together. The hard work of gardening was shared by all. They took turns pulling weeds to tending to the process, and eventually the harvest was shared by all. Conversations started happening between our congregations about how important gardening was to Hmong culture. And many of the older members shared through younger members who translated how they had grown up gardening in the mountains of Laos. I started to see conversations take place between congregation members that I hadn't seen before, and eventually deeper relationships started to develop. The garden built a bridge between our two congregations, and at the end of the growing season, the Hmong congregation prepared traditional Hmong dishes using the vegetables from their garden with the members of our church to try. Our parish nurse wrote an article about the whole experience and titled it, "Building Bridges in the Dirt." A garden that was built with the purpose of drawing neighbors from around the community together. A garden that felt like a failure of a project for such a long time had a bigger purpose in the end. In our first reading for today, when God provides manna for the Israelites, they wonder what it is. They had never seen food like this fine, flaky substance before. Perhaps they expected something more familiar, like bread. But God surprises them. God gives them what they need, not what they expect. And I wonder how often we miss the work of God in our lives because we expect God to show up in one way, and God shows up in another.